She sat in the debriefing room with her flight suit still damp from perspiration, the fabric clinging to her small frame like a second skin. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with that particular military frequency that seemed to exist nowhere else in the world. Her helmet rested on the metal table beside her, its surface scratched and scorched from something the three colonels across from her were still trying to understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been back on the ground for exactly 47 minutes. Her F-16 Viper, tail number 890421, sat in the maintenance hangar 3 buildings away, its engine still ticking as it cooled. The aircraft bore marks that shouldn't have been there, paint scraped from the wingtips, hydraulic fluid leaking from stress points that weren't supposed to exist, and a radio antenna that had been bent at an impossible angle. The maintenance chief had walked around the aircraft twice before shaking his head and muttering something about physics that shouldn't work. The crew chief had run his hands along the fuselage, pausing at impact points that measured barely inches apart, as if the aircraft had been threaded through a needle made of steel and fire. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the silence stretching across the debriefing room like a taut cable, ready to snap at the first wrong word. Colonel Martinez sat in the center chair, his weathered face unreadable as he studied the flight data recorder printout spread before him. The paper trail told a story that defied both regulation and reason. To his left, Colonel Washington leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Sarah with the kind of intensity reserved for puzzles that refused to be solved. She had been the one to initially recommend Sarah for grounding pending psychological evaluation. The recommendation still sat in her briefcase, unsigned but not forgotten. Colonel Brooks occupied the right chair, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm. On the table's surface, he was the operations officer, the man responsible for mission planning and pilot assignments, the man who had specifically excluded Sarah from the morning's flight roster, the man who had marked her file with a red notation that read, "Inappropriate for combat operations due to physical limitations." Sarah's flight suit bore the wrinkles of 6 hours in a cockpit that wasn't supposed to accommodate someone of her stature. At 5 feet 2 inches, she fell below the minimum height requirement. Full F-16 pilots by a full inch. The waiver that had allowed her to fly at all had been a bureaucratic miracle, pushed through by instructors who insisted that her spatial awareness and reaction times compensated for what she lacked in physical reach. That waiver felt meaningless. Now sitting across from 3 colonels who had to reconcile the impossible with the undeniable. The mission she had just completed wasn't supposed to exist. The aircraft she had flown wasn't supposed to be airborne. The route she had taken wasn't supposed to be survivable. The data recorder showed her aircraft descending to altitudes that would have been suicidal for any other pilot. Radar tracking indicated she had flown through airspace that intelligence had marked as impenetrable. Communications logs revealed she had maintained radio silence for portions of the flight that should have required constant coordination with ground control. Colonel Martinez finally looked up from the papers, his dark eyes meeting Sarah's without warmth or condemnation. "Lieutenant Chun," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in the Air Force, "your aircraft was observed entering hostile airspace at 0347 hours. Your flight plan showed you were assigned to hangar duty for the day." Sarah nodded. Once, a barely perceptible movement that acknowledged the statement without offering explanation. Her hands remained folded in her lap, steady despite the caffeine that still coursed through her system from the pre-dawn hours. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, silence was often the safest response. Your wingmen reported losing visual contact with your aircraft approximately 15 minutes into what should have been a routine patrol mission, Colonel Washington added. His last transmission indicated you had descended below the minimum. Safe altitude for the designated flight corridor. The wingman in question, Captain Torres, had filed a report that read like fiction. According to his account, Sarah's F-16 had simply vanished from his radar screen, disappearing into a canyon system that their map showed as impassable for fixed-wing aircraft. He had circled the area for 20 minutes, calling her calcine. Over the radio, receiving nothing but static in response. When Torres had finally returned to base, his aircraft's flight recorder showed him flying increasingly erratic patterns, searching for gaps in the terrain that might explain where his lead aircraft had gone. His post-flight interview had been brief and uncomfortable, filled with admissions that he had lost track of another pilot in what should have been routine airspace. Sarah's reappearance had been equally mysterious. Air traffic control had picked up her transponder signal emerging from a section of sky that their coverage maps showed as radar dead. Her radio had crackled to life with a brief transmission requesting permission to land, her voice calm and professional despite the circumstances that had brought her back. The ground crew had been expecting a routine post-flight inspection. Instead, they had found an aircraft that looked like it had been flying through an obstacle course designed by someone with a twisted sense of humor. The leading edges of the wings showed scrape marks consistent with contact with solid objects. The vertical stabilizer had paint transfer from sources that couldn't be immediately identified. Most puzzling of all was the condition of the cockpit. Sarah's ejection seat showed signs of extreme G-force stress, with harness marks indicating she had been pressed against the restraints with forces that should have caused unconsciousness. Her helmet's heads-up display had recorded data that the technicians were still trying to interpret, showing flight parameters that fell outside normal operational envelopes. But the most telling evidence was what hadn't been found. There were no bullet holes in the aircraft's skin, no shrapnel damage, no signs of the kind of combat that would have explained the unusual flight path. Instead, the damage suggested precision flying through spaces too small for conventional. Aircraft Operations. Colonel Brooks leaned forward, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Lieutenant, your aircraft's GPS tracking shows you flew through a section of airspace that our intelligence reports indicated was heavily defended. Our satellite imagery from that time period shows no evidence of defensive fire or aircraft pursuit. How do you explain the absence of hostile contact?" Sarah's eyes moved to the window beside the table, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight line. She could see other F-16s being prepped for evening missions, their crews moving with the practiced efficiency of pilots who had never had to explain the impossible. "I stayed low," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lower than they were expecting." The three colonels exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke of years of shared experience and mutual understanding. They had all read the intelligence reports. They knew what staying low meant in the context of the terrain Sarah had flown through. They also knew that the clearances involved were measured in feet, not the hundreds of feet that conventional wisdom demanded. Colonel Martinez picked up a photograph from the stack of papers before him. It showed Sarah's F-16 from above, captured by a reconnaissance drone that had been loitering in the area. The aircraft appeared to be flying through a narrow canyon, its wingtips barely clearing the rock walls on either side. The timestamp on the image corresponded exactly with the period when Captain Torres had reported losing visual contact. "This photograph," Martinez said, turning the image so Sarah could see it, "was taken by an unmanned asset operating in the region. The canyon you're flying through measures 63 feet across at its narrowest point. The wingspan of an F-16 is 32 feet, 8 inches. That leaves you with roughly 15 feet of clearance on each side." Sarah studied the photograph without emotion. She remembered that moment, the sensation of the aircraft responding to control inputs measured in fractions of inches. She remembered the way the canyon walls had seemed to reach toward her, the play of shadows and light that had made depth perception nearly impossible. 15 feet, she repeated, more to herself than to the colonels. That's assuming perfect. Centered flight with no wind deviation. Colonel Washington leaned forward, her expression intense. Lieutenant, the meteorological data from that time period shows gusting crosswinds of up to 25 knots. Those conditions would make precision. Flying through such a narrow space virtually impossible for most pilots. The word most hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had heard it before, in different contexts and from different people. Most pilots couldn't adapt to the physical limitations of a smaller cockpit. Most pilots couldn't compensate for shorter reach to critical controls. Most pilots couldn't maintain situational awareness when their field of view was restricted by proportionally larger safety equipment. She had spent her entire career proving that most didn't apply to her. The same physical characteristics that had nearly prevented her from flying military aircraft had become advantages in situations that demanded precision over power, finesse over force. The debriefing room fell silent again, the only sound the distant whine of jet engines spinning up for the evening's operations. Sarah could hear the familiar cadence of pre-flight communications, the call and response between pilots and ground crews that had become the soundtrack of her professional life. Colonel Brooks cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Lieutenant, your unauthorized deviation from the assigned flight path resulted in your aircraft entering hostile territory without proper clearance or support. The mission you appear to have completed was not sanctioned by this command. We need to understand what drove you to make that decision. Sarah's hands tightened slightly in her lap, the only outward sign of the tension that had been building since she had walked into the room. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long flight back to base. But knowing and experiencing were different things, and the weight of 3 colonels' expectations pressed down on her like the G-forces she had endured hours earlier. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Colonel Martinez nodded once. "Granted." Sarah took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I observed intelligence gathering that indicated an immediate threat to friendly forces. The conventional response protocols would have required time we didn't have. I made a tactical decision to neutralize the threat using the resources available." The explanation was deliberately vague, skirting the edges of what she could reveal without compromising ongoing operations. But the 3 colonels were experienced enough to read between the lines, to understand that Sarah had acted on information that hadn't been available to the broader command structure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Colonel Washington opened a file folder and removed a single sheet of paper. "This is the after-action report from the ground unit that was operating in the sector you flew through. Their mission was compromised approximately 1 hour before your unauthorized flight. They reported taking fire from positions that our intelligence had not identified as hostile." Sarah remained silent, but her eyes flicked to the paper in Washington's hands. She had known about the ground unit and had monitored their communications frequency during her approach to the target area. Their distress calls had been the catalyst for her decision to deviate from the planned route. "The ground unit's report indicates that hostile fire ceased abruptly at 04:02 hours, Washington continued. "Their observer reported seeing a single aircraft operating at extremely low altitude in the vicinity of the enemy positions. The aircraft departed the area before they could establish visual identification." The timeline matched Sarah's flight path exactly. She had been in the target area at 04:02, had completed her mission objectives, and had begun the return flight that would bring her back to base through the canyon system that should have been impassable. Colonel Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant, the ground unit's mission was classified at a level above your clearance. You shouldn't have known about their operation or their location. Yet your flight path suggests you had detailed knowledge of both. Sarah met his gaze directly. I monitored all available communications frequencies during my flight, sir. When I heard the distress calls, I made a decision to render assistance. It was a careful answer, technically accurate but incomplete. She had indeed monitored the communications, but her knowledge of the ground unit's mission had come from sources that she couldn't reveal in the current setting. The intelligence network that had provided her with the information operated outside normal command channels, relying on personal relationships and unofficial information sharing. Colonel Brooks consulted his own set of papers, his expression growing more puzzled. Lieutenant, your aircraft's weapon systems show evidence of being armed and fired during your unauthorized flight. The munitions log indicates you expended 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 150 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition. Those weapons were not authorized for your supposed hangar duty assignment. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The weapons usage was the most difficult aspect of her situation to explain. Unauthorized weapons employment was a serious violation of military protocol, one that could result in court-martial proceedings, regardless of the tactical necessity that had driven her actions. I encountered hostile forces that posed an immediate threat to friendly personnel, she said carefully. I engaged those forces using the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. The three colonels exchanged another look, this one weighted with implications that Sarah could only guess at. She had crossed multiple lines during her unauthorized flight, had violated protocols that existed for good reasons. But she had also saved lives, had eliminated threats that the conventional command structure hadn't even known existed. Colonel Martinez closed the file folder in front of him, a gesture that seemed to signal the end of the formal questioning. Lieutenant Chun, you are hereby relieved of flight duties pending a full investigation into your actions. You will report to the base commander's office at 0800 hours tomorrow for further instructions. Sarah stood, her movements precise and controlled despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours and had flown a mission that had pushed both her aircraft and her skills to their limits. The relief of flight duties was not unexpected, but it still felt like a physical blow. Understood, sir, she said, reaching for her helmet. Colonel Washington's voice stopped her at the door. Lieutenant, one more question. The aircraft you flew today, the F-16 Viper, has a minimum height requirement for pilots. You received a waiver to fly despite falling below that requirement. Do you believe your physical stature contributed to your ability to complete today's mission? Sarah paused, her hand on the door handle. It was a question that struck at the heart of her entire career, at the doubts and challenges that had followed her from flight school through every assignment. It was also a question that she had never been asked so directly by senior officers. Yes, ma'am, she said without turning around. I believe it did. She left the debriefing room without waiting for a response, walking through corridors that suddenly felt different, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. Word of her unauthorized flight had spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Other pilots watched her pass with expressions that mixed curiosity, concern, and something that might have been respect. The maintenance hangar was her destination, drawn by a need to see her aircraft one more time before the investigation began in earnest. The F-16 sat under bright work lights, surrounded by technicians who were documenting every scratch, every anomaly, every piece of evidence that might explain what had happened in the skies above the disputed territory. Sarah stood at the edge of the work area, close enough to see the aircraft but far enough away to avoid interfering with the technical inspection. The Viper looked smaller than usual under the harsh lights, its sleek lines emphasized by the damage that told the story of her flight better than any official report ever could. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, approached her with a clipboard in his hands, and an expression that mixed professional concern with personal curiosity. He had been working on military aircraft for 23 years and had seen damage from combat operations, training accidents, and mechanical failures. But he had never seen anything quite like what Sarah's F-16 displayed. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying the informal respect that senior enlisted personnel showed to pilots they trusted. "I've been working on these birds since before you were born. I've never seen damage patterns like this. It's like your aircraft was designed to fly through spaces it was never meant to fit." Sarah nodded, unable to find words that would adequately explain what she had experienced. The flight had been unlike anything in her training and had demanded skills and judgment that she hadn't known she possessed. The aircraft had responded to her control inputs with a precision that bordered on the miraculous, and had performed maneuvers that the engineering specifications said were impossible. "The wing tip scrapes," Rodriguez continued, consulting his clipboard. "They're consistent with contact with solid rock surfaces. But the pattern suggests multiple contact points, as if you were flying through a series of obstacles that required constant correction. The stress patterns on the airframe show G-forces that should have caused structural failure." Sarah studied the aircraft's wing, seeing the evidence of her flight path written in scraped paint and stressed metal. Each mark represented a moment when the margin between success and disaster had been measured in inches, when her survival depended on skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom or simulator. The investigation would continue for days, possibly weeks. Technical experts would analyze every piece of data, every anomaly, every deviation from normal flight parameters. They would try to understand how a pilot who didn't meet the minimum physical requirements for her aircraft had accomplished something that more qualified pilots might not have attempted. But Sarah knew that the real story couldn't be found in flight recorders or damage reports. It was written in the lives of the ground unit she had saved, in the enemy positions she had neutralized, in the split-second decisions that had turned an impossible situation into an unlikely victory. She walked away from the hangar as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the moments just before dawn, when she had first seen the canyon that would challenge everything she thought she knew about flying. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who fit through the spaces that others can't even see. 3 weeks earlier, Nellis Air Force Base hummed with the controlled chaos of pre-dawn operations. The flight line stretched into darkness, punctuated by the occasional sweep of runway lights and the distant glow of the control tower. Aircraft sat in neat rows, their angular silhouettes creating shadows that shifted with each passing vehicle. Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood in the briefing room at 0430 hours, coffee mug in hand, listening to Major Harrison outline the day's training objectives. The room smelled of industrial carpet and recycled air, with undertones of jet fuel that seemed permanently embedded in the building's ventilation system. Fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh white glow that made the early hour feel even more unforgiving. Around her, 11 other pilots occupied metal folding chairs arranged in precise rows. Some took notes on tablets, others sketched diagrams on paper, and a few simply listened with the focused attention that came from years of military discipline. These were experienced aviators, most with combat deployments and thousands of flight hours in their LOGB OOKS. Sarah occupied a chair in the second row, her smaller frame requiring her to adjust the seat height to see over the pilot in front of her. Captain Reynolds, a 6-foot-tall veteran of 3 overseas deployments, unconsciously leaned back in his chair, further blocking her view of the projection screen. She shifted slightly to the left, finding an angle that allowed her to see the tactical display showing their assigned training area. Today's exercise simulates close air support in mountainous terrain, Major Harrison continued, his laser pointer dancing across topographical features that rose from the Nevada desert like broken teeth. Weather conditions are marginal VFR with gusty surface winds. Ceiling is forecast at 8,000 feet with scattered clouds building throughout the morning. The major was a compact man in his late 30s, with the precise movements and clipped speech of someone who had learned to communicate complex information quickly and clearly. His flight suit bore patches from previous assignments that read like a tour of global conflict zones, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and half a dozen other locations where American pilots had learned their trade under fire. Lieutenant Jake Brennan raised his hand from the front row. "Sir, what's the minimum altitude for the bombing runs?" His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the cockpit, never questioned whether he belonged among the elite community of fighter pilots. "Simulated weapons release at no lower than 500 feet, a GL," Harrison replied. "Hard deck is 300 feet. Anyone who breaks altitude restrictions will find themselves in my office explaining why safety protocols don't apply to them." Sarah made a note on her kneeboard card, though the altitude restrictions were standard for training operations. She had flown similar profiles dozens of times, had learned to thread her aircraft through mountain valleys with precision that impressed even seasoned instructors. Her small stature, which had nearly disqualified her from pilot training, had become an unexpected advantage in the cramped confines of fighter cockpits. Captain Angela Foster, seated 2 rows behind Sarah, leaned forward to address the major. "Sir, what's the threat environment for today's exercise? Are we expecting surface-to-air simulation?" Foster was known for thorough preparation. The kind of pilot who studied intelligence reports with the intensity of a graduate student researching a dissertation. "Negative on SAM threats," Harrison replied. "This is a basic close air support evolution. Focus on target identification, weapons delivery accuracy, and coordination with ground controllers. Keep it simple, keep it safe." The briefing continued with weather updates, communication procedures, and emergency protocols. Sarah listened with the kind of attention that had carried her through every stage of her military career, from the initial flight screening that had nearly eliminated her due to her height, through the rigorous training programs that had tested every aspect of her flying ability. Her journey to this briefing room had been anything but routine. The Air Force had height requirements for F-16 pilots that reflected decades of cockpit design and safety testing. Pilots needed to reach critical controls under emergency conditions, needed to maintain visual contact with other aircraft during formation flying, needed to operate ejection seats that were calibrated for specific body proportions. At 5 feet 2 inches, Sarah fell below every minimum standard. Her initial application for pilot training had been rejected automatically, processed by a computer system that flagged her anthropometric measurements as incompatible with fighter aircraft operations. It had taken a congressional inquiry, initiated by her college physics professor who happened to be a retired Air Force general, to get her case reviewed by human evaluators. The review process had been exhaustive and occasionally humiliating. Sarah had been measured, tested, and evaluated by specialists who treated her like a fascinating anomaly rather than an aspiring pilot. She had demonstrated her ability to reach every control in F-16 cockpits, had proven that her shorter limbs could operate ejection handles with the same effectiveness as taller pilots, had shown that her lower eye position actually improved her ability to see critical flight instruments. Most importantly, she had excelled in every academic and practical test that the Air Force could devise. Her spatial reasoning scores ranked in the top 1% of all applicants. Her hand-eye coordination exceeded the measurements of pilots who had been flying for decades. Her ability to process multiple information streams simultaneously suggested an aptitude for multitasking that could not be taught or improved through training. The waiver that had finally allowed her to enter pilot training had been a bureaucratic Masterpiece. Signed by officers who had never met her, but who were willing to bet that exceptional skills could overcome physical limitations. The document had followed her through every stage of her career, a reminder that she operated outside normal parameters, that her presence in fighter cockpits was an experiment that could be terminated at any time. Now, sitting in the briefing room at Nellis, Sarah represented the successful conclusion of that experiment. She had graduated from pilot training in the top 10% of her class, had completed advanced fighter training with ratings that qualified her for any mission the Air Force could assign. But she also knew that her success was constantly being evaluated, that any mistake or deviation from expected performance would be scrutinized more carefully than similar actions by her peers. Major Harrison concluded the formal briefing and dismissed the pilots to their individual aircraft preparations. The room emptied with the organized movement of professionals who had performed these routines hundreds of times. Sarah gathered her materials and headed for the equipment room, where her personal gear waited in a locker that bore her name and call sign, Pocket. The call sign had been inevitable, a reference to her size that could have been derogatory but had instead become a badge of honor. Her fellow pilots used it with the casual familiarity that marked acceptance into the tight-knit community of military aviators. It appeared on flight schedules, mission assignments, and the informal communications that bound squadron members together. In the equipment room, Sarah methodically donned the layers of protective gear that transformed her from a slight young woman into a barely contained bundle of survival equipment. The flight suit hung loose on her frame, requiring adjustments that had been custom-tailored to accommodate her proportions. The survival vest, designed for much larger torsos, had been modified with additional straps and padding that prevented the equipment from shifting during high-G maneuvers. Most challenging was the helmet, a complex piece of equipment that housed communication systems, heads-up display projectors, and night vision interfaces. Standard helmets were too large for Sarah's head, creating dangerous gaps that could allow dangerous pressure differentials during ejection sequences. Her helmet had been specially fitted, with custom padding that ensured proper seal integrity, while maintaining access to all critical systems. Captain Marcus Webb approached his adjacent locker, his movements deliberate and economical. Webb was a 10-year veteran of fighter operations, with deployments to 3 combat zones and a reputation for technical precision that had earned him instructor pilot status. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, making him one of the larger pilots in the squadron, and his flight gear fit him with the comfortable familiarity of a second skin. "Morning, Pocket," he said, his tone carrying the easy camaraderie of shared professional respect. "You drew tail number 421 today. That bird's been giving the maintenance folks some trouble with the environmental control system. Might run a little warm in the cockpit." Sarah nodded her acknowledgement while adjusting the connections on her G-suit, a garment that would inflate during high-G maneuvers to prevent blood from pooling in her lower extremities. The G-suit, like most of her equipment, had required modifications to fit her smaller frame properly. Standard sizes created gaps and pressure points that could be dangerous during the extreme physical stresses of fighter flight. "Thanks for the heads up," she replied. "Any word on what kind of trouble? Intermittent or constant?" Webb consulted a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. "Intermittent temperature regulation. Should be fine for today's training profile, but keep an eye on the cockpit temp gauge. If it starts climbing past normal limits, don't try to tough it out." The advice was both practical and personal. Fighter pilots were notorious for attempting to complete missions, despite equipment malfunctions that should have resulted in mission termination. The culture of the community emphasized mission accomplishment above personal comfort, sometimes to the detriment of safety and common sense. For Sarah, the temperature warning carried additional significance. Her smaller body mass made her more susceptible to heat-related problems, while her custom-fitted equipment reduced her ability to vent excess heat through normal means. A malfunctioning environmental control system could create serious problems. During the planned training mission, Lieutenant Kim Rodriguez emerged from the adjacent row of lockers, her pre-flight routine completed with the efficiency of someone who had learned to minimize preparation time without sacrificing thoroughness. Rodriguez was relatively new to the squadron, having arrived from her initial fighter training just 6 months earlier. She possessed the eager intensity of a pilot still proving herself, still learning the subtle differences between training exercises and operational flying. "Hey, Sarah," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the slight accent that reflected her Texas upbringing. "Did you see the weather update? Winds are starting to pick up ahead of schedule. Might make the target runs more interesting than Harrison planned." Sarah had indeed seen the updated weather forecast, delivered through the base meteorological system that provided real-time conditions throughout their assigned training area. Surface winds were gusting to 30 knots with stronger winds aloft. That could create significant turbulence in the mountain valleys where they would be operating. "Should still be within limits for the exercise," Sarah replied, though she made a mental note to pay extra attention to wind effects during her approach. Phases. Strong surface winds could create downdrafts and wind shear conditions that were particularly challenging for lighter aircraft and smaller pilots. The 3 pilots completed their preparations and headed for the flight line, where their assigned F-16s waited under the gradually lightening sky. Dawn was still an hour away, but the eastern horizon showed the first hint of color that promised clear conditions once the sun cleared the surrounding mountains. Sarah's aircraft, tail number 890421, sat in the 3rd position of a line of 12 Vipers that would participate in the morning's training exercise. The F-16 was a single-seat, single-engine fighter that had been the backbone of American tactical aviation for more than 4 decades. Despite its age, the design remained relevant through continuous upgrades that had improved its avionics, weapons systems, and survivability. For Sarah, the F-16 represented the perfect marriage of size and capability. Unlike larger, twin-engine fighters that required pilots to manage multiple systems simultaneously, the Viper was designed around the concept of a single pilot operating all systems with minimal workload. The cockpit was compact but not cramped, allowing shorter pilots to reach all controls without the stretching and awkward positioning that characterized larger aircraft. Senior Airman Patricia Kim, the crew chief responsible for Aircraft 421, met Sarah at the base of the crew ladder that provided access to the cockpit. Kim was a 10-year veteran of aircraft maintenance, with the kind of practical knowledge that came from working on fighter aircraft through all kinds of weather and operational conditions. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Kim said, offering Sarah the aircraft's maintenance log for review. "Pre-flight inspection is complete. Oil levels are good, fuel load is full, and all systems checked normal except for the environmental control issue Captain Webb mentioned." Sarah climbed the crew ladder with practiced ease, her smaller frame actually making the ascent easier than it was for taller pilots, who had to fold themselves awkwardly to fit through the cockpit opening. She settled into the ejection seat, immediately beginning the ritual of connecting life support systems, adjusting seat position, and verifying that all controls were within comfortable reach. The cockpit of an F-16 was a masterpiece of ergonomic design, with every switch, button, and display positioned according to decades of research into human factors engineering. For most pilots, the layout represented the optimal balance between accessibility and functionality. For Sarah, it represented a workspace that had been specifically evaluated and approved for her unique physical characteristics. She ran through the pre-start checklist with methodical precision, each item verified and confirmed before moving to the next. External power was connected and provided electricity to aircraft systems. Flight controls moved freely through their full range of motion. Weapon stations were configured for training ordnance. Communication and navigation systems responded. properly to input commands. Around the flight line, 11 other pilots were conducting identical preparations in their respective aircraft. The morning air carried the sounds of jet engines starting up, the whine of hydraulic systems coming online, and the radio chatter of pilots coordinating their departure from the parking area. Captain Torres, flying as Sarah's wingman for the training mission, completed his pre-flight procedures in the aircraft, parked immediately to her left. Torres was a solid, reliable pilot with the kind of steady temperament that made him an ideal wingman. His flying was precise without being flashy, conservative without being timid. "Pocket, this is Steel 2, Torres called over the radio, using the call signs assigned for the day's mission. "Pre-flight complete, ready for taxi when you are." Sarah acknowledged the call while completing her own checklist. The routine of preparing for flight had become second nature, a sequence of actions performed so many times that they required minimal conscious thought. But today felt different somehow, charged with an energy that she couldn't quite identify. Difference wasn't in the mission profile, which was standard close air support training that she had flown dozens of times. It wasn't in the weather conditions, which were challenging but well within her experience level. It wasn't in the aircraft or the crew assignments or any of the measurable factors that distinguished one training flight from another. Instead, it was something more subtle, a sense that the routine morning mission might become something more significant. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts during years of flying, had discovered that her subconscious mind often processed information faster than her analytical thinking could follow. As she completed the final items on her pre-flight checklist and prepared to request taxi clearance from ground control, Sarah felt the familiar anticipation that preceded every flight. But underlying that familiar feeling was something new, a premonition that today's routine training mission might demand skills and judgment that she had never been asked to demonstrate before. The taxi clearance came through at 0547 hours, delivered. In the clipped professionalism of air traffic controllers who had been managing military aircraft movements since before most of the pilots had learned to drive. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began the careful process of maneuvering her F-16 from the parking spot toward the active runway, following the yellow taxiway lines that crisscrossed Nellis Air Force Base like a geometric puzzle. Behind her, Captain Torres maintained proper spacing in his own aircraft, the two F-16s moving in the choreographed dance that military aviation had perfected over decades of operations. Their formation was part of a larger stream of aircraft departing for various training missions throughout the Nevada Test and Training Range, a vast expanse of restricted airspace where pilots could practice combat maneuvers without civilian air traffic concerns. As Sarah approached the engine run-up area, her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission from the Squadron Operations Center. The voice belonged to Captain Morrison, the duty officer responsible for monitoring all squadron aircraft during training missions. His tone carried an urgency that wasn't typical for routine training operations. "Steel Flight Ops, be advised we have reports of increased activity in the northern sectors of your assigned training area. Recommend you monitor guard frequency for possible traffic advisories." Sarah frowned behind her helmet visor. Guard frequency was the emergency channel monitored by all military aircraft, typically used for distress calls and urgent safety information. The fact that Morrison was recommending they monitor it during a routine training mission suggested that something unusual was happening in their assigned airspace. "Steel lead copies," Sarah responded. "Any specific nature of the reported activity?" There was a pause before Morrison replied, long enough to suggest he was consulting with someone else in the operations center. "Negative specific details at this time. Just maintain heightened awareness and report any unusual observations." The exchange was brief and professionally worded, but it carried implications that Sarah's experience allowed her to interpret. Military communications were deliberately understated, with serious concerns often expressed through subtle changes in procedures rather than dramatic announcements. The fact that operations was alerting them to unspecified activity suggested that someone, somewhere, had observed something that didn't belong in their training area. Captain Torres had obviously heard the same transmission. His voice came through the radio with a question that mirrored Sarah's own thoughts. "Steel lead, any idea what kind of activity Ops is talking about?" "Negative," Sarah replied. "But let's keep our eyes open once we get to the training area." The run-up area allowed pilots to perform final checks of their aircraft systems before takeoff, ensuring that engines, flight controls, and avionics were functioning properly. Sarah methodically worked through the checklist, each item verified and confirmed before advancing to the next. Engine parameters showed normal operation. Flight controls responded correctly to her inputs, and all cockpit displays indicated systems ready for flight. But as she completed the routine checks, Sarah noticed something that hadn't been mentioned. In the maintenance logs, the radar warning receiver, designed to alert pilots to threats from surface-to-air missiles and enemy aircraft, was displaying intermittent signals that didn't correspond to any known emitters in the training area. The signals were brief and weak, barely registering on the equipment's sensitivity threshold. Under normal circumstances, such signals would be dismissed as electromagnetic interference from the base's communication systems or spurious emissions from civilian radar installations. But combined with the unusual advisory from operations, the intermittent signals took on a different significance. Sarah keyed her radio to contact Torres. "Steel 2, are you getting any hits on your RWR?" "Checking," Torres replied. After a moment, his voice returned with a note of puzzlement. "Affirmative, intermittent signals bearing northwest. Very weak, probably just interference." Sarah made a mental note of the bearing Torres had reported. Northwest of their current position lay the most remote sections of the Nevada test and training range, areas where classified testing sometimes occurred beyond the knowledge of routine training missions. The signals they were detecting could represent legitimate testing activities, but they could also indicate something more concerning. Takeoff clearance came through on schedule, and Sarah advanced her throttle to military power, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as her F-16 rolled down the runway. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, and she retracted the landing gear while maintaining the precise climb profile that would take them to their assigned altitude and heading. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from Nellis Approach Control. The controller's voice carried the professional calm that characterized routine traffic management, but the content of his message was anything but routine. "Steel flight, contact battleground control on frequency 285.7 for training coordination. Be advised that your original training area has been temporarily reassigned. You are cleared to proceed to alternate area Bravo 7 for your scheduled exercise." Sarah felt a subtle shift in her situational awareness, the kind of mental adjustment that experienced pilots made when circumstances deviated from planned operations. Training areas weren't reassigned casually, especially not on short notice during active missions. The change suggested that something was happening in their original assigned airspace that took priority over routine training operations. "Steel lead copies, switching to battleground control," Sarah acknowledged, while making rapid mental calculations about the fuel implications of flying to the alternate training area. Bravo 7 was approximately 40 nautical miles further from Nellis than their original assignment, a distance that would reduce their training time and potentially affect their planned return schedule. Torres had obviously made the same calculations. His voice came through on their discrete frequency with controlled concern. "Steel lead, the alternate area puts us pretty close to the northern boundary of the range. That's where those RWR hits were coming from." Sarah had reached the same conclusion. The coincidence of being reassigned to an area near the source of the mysterious radar signals was too significant to ignore. Someone was directing them toward whatever was causing the electromagnetic emissions, either intentionally or as a result of circumstances beyond routine training planning. As they leveled off at their assigned altitude and headed toward the new training area, Sarah began monitoring additional radio frequencies beyond those required for the training mission. Military aircraft carried sophisticated communication systems capable of receiving multiple frequencies simultaneously, allowing pilots to maintain awareness of activities beyond their immediate operational environment. What she heard on the extended frequency scan was disturbing. Fragmentary communications between units that weren't supposed to be operating in the Nevada range suggested that some kind of unplanned activity was taking place in the northern sectors. The transmissions were encrypted and difficult to interpret, but the urgency in the voices was unmistakable. "Steel 2, are you monitoring any other frequencies?" Sarah asked Torres over their private channel. "Negative, just our assigned frex," Torres replied. "Should I be listening to something specific?" Sarah hesitated before responding. Encouraging her wingmen to monitor unauthorized frequencies could be construed as violating communication procedures, but her growing sense that something significant was happening outweighed her concern about regulatory compliance. "Try scanning the upper UHF bands," she suggested. "See if you pick up anything unusual." As they approached the alternate training area, Sarah's radar began painting targets that shouldn't have been there. The airspace was supposed to be clear, except for their flight and the ground controllers who would be directing their simulated combat missions. Instead, her radar showed multiple contacts at various altitudes and ranges, some moving in patterns that suggested military aircraft operating under some kind of tactical control. The targets weren't broadcasting the electronic identifiers that would mark them as friendly aircraft participating in scheduled training exercises. They weren't following the standardized flight patterns that characterized most military operations in the range. Instead, they appeared to be operating under some kind of operational security protocol that kept their identities and missions concealed from routine observation. Sarah's training and experience had taught her to trust her instruments, but the radar picture she was seeing didn't match any of the briefed activities for their assigned training time. Either her aircraft systems were malfunctioning in a very specific way, or there were aircraft operating in their vicinity that weren't supposed to be there. "Steel lead, I'm showing multiple unknown contacts on radar," Torres reported, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a pilot encountering unexpected circumstances. "Bearing northwest, various altitudes, no IFF identification." The confirmation from Torres eliminated the possibility that Sarah's radar was malfunctioning. Both aircraft were painting the same targets, which meant that unidentified aircraft were indeed operating in their assigned training area. The question was whether these aircraft represented a planned exercise that hadn't been briefed to them, or something more concerning. Sarah made a decision that would later be scrutinized by investigators and commanders. Instead of immediately contacting Battleground Control to report the unidentified aircraft, she chose to observe and gather information before making any formal reports. Her rationale was that premature reports of unknown aircraft could disrupt legitimate classified operations that were simply beyond her clearance level. "Steel 2, maintain current heading and altitude," she instructed Torres. "Let's see if we can get a better picture of what's happening before we start making radio calls." As they flew deeper into the alternate training area, the electromagnetic environment became increasingly complex. Sarah's radar warning receiver was now displaying almost continuous signals from multiple directions, indicating the presence of numerous radar systems operating in frequency bands, typically associated with surface-to-air missile installations and airborne early warning aircraft. The signals were far too sophisticated to be explained by the training equipment normally used in the Nevada range. They suggested the presence of actual combat systems, either deployed for some kind of advanced testing or belonging to Forces that shouldn't have been operating in American airspace. Sarah's fuel management calculations told her that they had approximately 90 minutes of flight time remaining before they would need to begin their return to Nellis. Under normal circumstances, that would provide adequate time for their scheduled training objectives with a comfortable safety margin. But the current circumstances were anything but normal. Steel Lead Battleground Control, came a transmission that interrupted Sarah's analysis of the tactical situation. Report your position and status for training coordination. Sarah glanced at her navigation display before responding. Battleground, Steel Lead is 20 miles south of Area Bravo 7. Level at flight level 250, ready for training coordination. Steel Lead, be advised that training activities in your area may be suspended due to range conflicts. Stand by for further instructions. The term range conflicts was military euphemism for situations where multiple activities were competing for the same airspace, typically resolved through coordination between the various units involved. But Sarah's experience told her that such conflicts were usually anticipated and resolved during mission planning, not discovered after aircraft were already airborne and approaching their assigned areas. Torres keyed his radio with a question that reflected the growing confusion surrounding their mission. Steel Lead, should we request vectors back to Nellis? Sounds like whatever we came out here to do isn't going to happen. Before Sarah could respond, her radar warning receiver suddenly erupted with alarm tones indicating that her aircraft was being tracked by fire control radars typically associated with surface-to-air missile systems. The signals were strong and persistent, suggesting that whatever was tracking them was close enough and sophisticated enough to pose a genuine threat. Steel 2, are you getting missile lock warnings? Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline surge that accompanied the threat indicators. Affirmative, Torres replied, his own voice tight with controlled tension. Multiple emitters, bearing northwest. This doesn't feel like training anymore. Sarah's mind raced through the possible explanations for what they were experiencing. The most benign possibility was that they had inadvertently flown into a classified testing exercise involving realistic threat simulation equipment. The most concerning possibility was that actual hostile forces had somehow established operations within the Nevada test and training range. Neither explanation aligned with the briefed activities for their training mission or the normal security procedures that governed operations within the range. Sarah found herself confronting a situation that her training had prepared her for tactically, but not procedurally. Her aircraft and her wingmen were potentially under threat from unknown forces operating in airspace that was supposed to be under complete American control. Battleground Control, Steel Lead, Sarah transmitted, deciding that the situation had progressed beyond the point where observation without reporting was prudent. We are showing multiple threat emitters and unknown aircraft in Area Bravo 7. Request immediate clarification of range status and threat posture. The response from Battleground Control came after a delay that suggested consultation with higher authority. Steel Lead, maintain current position and altitude. Do not, repeat, do not attempt to identify or engage unknown contacts. Further instructions to follow. The warning against attempting to identify unknown aircraft was particularly significant. Standard procedures called for intercepting unidentified aircraft to determine their intentions and ensure they weren't violating restricted airspace. The fact that Sarah was being explicitly instructed not to follow those procedures suggested that the unknown aircraft were either known to range control or that the situation was too dangerous for routine interception procedures. As Sarah maintained her assigned position, she noticed that the unknown aircraft on her radar were not maintaining random flight patterns. Instead, they appeared to be operating in coordinated formations, with specific aircraft maintaining precise relationships to others in ways that suggested tactical organization and central control. The implication was chilling. If hostile forces had somehow established operations within one of America's most secure training ranges. The security implications extended far beyond the immediate threat to her flight. The Nevada Test and Training Range was home to some of the most classified military programs in existence, and a compromise of its security could have strategic consequences. But there was another possibility that Sarah's analytical mind considered as she watched the radar display. The aircraft and threat emitters could represent an unacknowledged American operation, possibly involving allied forces or contractor organizations, operating under classification levels that excluded routine training missions from awareness. Either way, Sarah and Torres found themselves in the middle of a situation that was far beyond the scope of their planned training mission. They were low on information, operating under restrictions that limited their ability to defend themselves, and flying aircraft that were configured for training rather than actual combat operations. The fuel gauge showed that time was becoming a critical factor. Whatever was happening in the northern sectors of the range, Sarah would soon need to make decisions about how long they could remain in the area before fuel management required them to begin their return to Nellis Dot as she contemplated their options. Sarah's instincts told her that the morning's routine training mission was about to become something far more significant and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The encrypted transmission came through on a frequency that Sarah wasn't supposed to be monitoring, crackling with the distinctive distortion of heavily secured communications. The voice was unfamiliar, speaking in code words that she didn't recognize, but the urgency was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere in the airspace around them, was reporting contact with hostile forces. Sarah's training had taught her to compartmentalize information, to focus on her immediate mission parameters while maintaining awareness of the broader tactical environment. But the fragments of communication she was intercepting suggested that the broader environment had become far more complex than anyone had briefed her to expect. "Alpha team is compromised. Repeat, Alpha team is compromised. Request immediate extraction from grid November-7-4. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static on the frequency. Sarah checked her navigation display to correlate the grid reference with her current position. November 7-4 was approximately 60 nautical miles northwest of her current location. Deep in the most remote section of the Nevada Test and Training Range, Captain Torres had been monitoring this same frequency. His voice came through their private channel with controlled tension. "Steel lead, did you copy that transmission about Alpha team?" "Affirmative," Sarah replied, her mind already working through the implications. "But we need to stay focused on our assigned mission parameters unless we receive specific instructions otherwise." Even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that the situation was evolving beyond the scope of routine training operations. The combination of unidentified aircraft, sophisticated threat emitters, and now emergency communications from unknown ground forces suggested that some kind of actual combat operation was taking place within what was supposed to be a secure training environment. Battleground. Control's voice cut through their private discussion. "Steel lead, we are reassigning your mission. Profile. Proceed to grid November 7-4 for reconnaissance and potential close air support. Switch to tactical frequency 267.3 for coordination with ground elements." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The grid reference mentioned in the encrypted transmission was now their assigned destination. The change from training exercise to actual close air support represented a fundamental shift in both the mission parameters and the associated risks. More importantly, it suggested that whatever was happening in the northern sectors of the range required immediate military response. "Steel lead copies," Sarah acknowledged. "Proceeding to November 7-4 for reconnaissance and CAS coordination." As she banked her F-16 toward the new heading, Sarah's fuel management calculations became critically important. The distance to the assigned grid, combined with the potential for extended operations in the target area, would leave them with minimal fuel reserves for the return flight to Nullis, if they encountered complications or were required to remain in the area for an extended period. Fuel could become a limiting factor in their ability to complete the mission. Torres had obviously made the same calculations. Steel lead, we're going to be tight on fuel if this turns into a prolonged engagement. Might want to consider requesting a tanker. Sarah nodded, though Torres couldn't see the gesture from his position in the adjacent aircraft. Aerial refueling would provide them with additional fuel, but it would also require coordinating with tanker aircraft that might not be immediately available. The decision to request refueling support would need to be made soon, before their fuel state declined to the point where they couldn't reach a rendezvous point. I'll make the call once we get a better picture of what we're dealing with, Sarah replied. As they flew toward the assigned grid, Sarah's radar began painting a more complex picture of the airspace ahead. Multiple aircraft were operating in what appeared to be coordinated patterns, with some contacts maintaining station at various altitudes while others moved in search patterns that suggested they were either looking for something or someone. Electromagnetic environment continued to intensify as they approached the target area. Sarah's radar warning receiver was now showing almost continuous threat signals from multiple directions, indicating the presence of sophisticated air defense systems that were actively tracking their approach. Steel 2 were flying into a fully developed threat environment, Sarah transmitted to Torres. Keep your eyes open and be ready to take evasive action if those threat signals transition to active engagement. Torres acknowledged the warning, and Sarah could see his aircraft adjusting position to maintain tactical spacing that would allow both pilots to maneuver independently if they came under attack. The formation they were flying had transitioned from the close fingertip position used for training exercises to the looser combat spread that maximized their survivability and tactical effectiveness. At 30 miles from the target grid, Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from the ground force that had requested support. The voice was strained, speaking in the clipped phrases that characterized military communications under stress. Any aircraft, this is Anvil 6. We are taking effective fire from multiple positions and require immediate close air support. Grid November 7-4, elevation 4,200 feet, marked with infrared strobe. Sarah switched to the tactical frequency and responded immediately. Anvil 6, this is Steel Lead, flight of 2 F-16S inbound from your position. What is your tactical situation? The response came through heavy static and occasional bursts of background noise that sounded like small arms fire. Steel Lead, Anvil 6. We are a reconnaissance team that has been compromised by hostile forces of unknown origin. We have wounded personnel and are running low on ammunition. Enemy forces have surrounded us and are attempting to close on our position. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of combat stress beginning to affect her physiology. Her heart rate increased, her breathing became more controlled, and her visual focus sharpened as her body prepared for the demands of combat operations. These were physiological responses that had been trained and refined through years of preparation, but they were now being activated by actual combat rather than simulation. Anvil 6, can you provide target identification and friendly positions? Sarah asked, beginning the process of gathering the information she would need to employ weapons safely and effectively. Steel Lead, friendlies are marked with IR strobes. At grid November 7-4, enemy positions are approximately 200 meters northeast, northwest, and southwest of our location. Multiple personnel with small arms and at least one crew-served weapon. Sarah's tactical display showed her current position relative to the target grid. At their current speed and heading, they would be overhead in the target area in approximately 8 minutes. But as she studied the terrain features displayed on her moving map, She realized that the geography of the target area presented significant challenges for conventional close air support operations. The grid reference was located in a narrow valley surrounded by high ridges that would limit the angles from which she could attack enemy positions. The terrain features would also restrict her ability to maneuver during attack runs, potentially exposing her aircraft to ground-based threats for extended periods. More concerning was the intelligence picture surrounding the engagement. The ground force was describing contact with hostile forces of unknown origin in an area that was supposed to be completely secure. The implication suggested either a catastrophic failure of range security or the presence of forces that weren't supposed to exist within American airspace. Steel 2, are you getting a good picture of the terrain in the target area? Sarah asked Torres. Affirmative, Torres replied. Looks like we're going to have to thread the needle between those ridges to get good attack angles. Not a lot of maneuvering room. Sarah's smaller stature, which had been a liability during her initial attempts to qualify for fighter pilot training, suddenly became a potential advantage. Her lower eye position in the cockpit actually improved her ability to see ground references during low-altitude operations, while her shorter limbs allowed her to make more precise control inputs during the kind of precision flying that would be required in the constrained airspace of the target valley. At 15 miles from the target, Sarah made a decision that would later be scrutinized by investigators and commanders. Instead of maintaining the minimum safe altitude prescribed for close air support operations, she chose to descend to an altitude that would allow her to operate below the surrounding ridgelines, using the terrain to mask her approach and provide protection from the sophisticated air defense systems that were tracking them. Steel 2, I'm going to take us down to the deck for the approach, Sarah transmitted. Follow me down and maintain visual contact. Torres acknowledged the instruction, though his voice carried a note of concern about the altitude Sarah was selecting. The terrain in the target area included peaks that rose to more than 8,000 feet above sea level, with valleys that contained obstacles and hazards that weren't always accurately depicted on their navigation charts. As Sarah began her descent, she monitored multiple information sources simultaneously. Her radar altimeter showed her height above the ground. Her barometric altimeter indicated her height above sea level, and her moving map display showed her position relative to known terrain features. But most importantly, her eyes were focused outside the cockpit, scanning the landscape ahead for obstacles and threats that her instruments might not detect. The F-16 descended through the thin mountain air with the controlled grace of an aircraft designed for precisely this kind of operation. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, making the small adjustments necessary to maintain her desired flight path, while accommodating the effects of mountain winds and air density variations. At 500 feet above the valley floor, Sarah leveled off and began her approach to the target area. The terrain around them rose on both sides, creating a natural corridor that channeled their flight path toward the grid, where friendly forces were engaged in combat with unknown hostiles. Anvil 6, Steel Lead is 2 minutes out, Sarah transmitted. Confirm your position with an IR marker and stand by for close air support. The response came immediately. Steel Lead, Anvil 6. We can see your aircraft approaching from the south. IR marker is active. Enemy forces are still maneuvering to close on our position. Sarah's radar warning receiver suddenly erupted with alarm tones indicating that her aircraft was being tracked by multiple fire control radars. The signals were strong and persistent, suggesting that whatever was tracking them was close enough and sophisticated enough to pose a genuine threat to their mission. Steel 2 were being painted by multiple SAM sites, Sarah transmitted to Torres. They're probably going to engage us once we commit to the attack. Torres' reply carried the controlled tension of a pilot facing his first actual combat engagement. Steel Lead, should we abort and request additional support? Sarah considered the options available to her. She could abort the mission and request that higher headquarters provide additional resources to deal with the threat environment. She could attempt to complete the mission using conventional tactics that would minimize her exposure to the air defense systems. Or she could use the unique capabilities of her aircraft and her own skills to accomplish the mission in a way that larger, more conventional forces might not be able to duplicate. The decision was complicated by the time factor. The ground force was engaged in active combat and had specifically requested immediate support. Any delay in providing that support could result in casualties among friendly forces, while the unknown hostiles could use the time to strengthen their positions or bring additional resources to bear. Sarah's fuel gauge showed that she had approximately 45 minutes of flight time remaining before she would need to begin her return to Nellis. If she committed to the attack, she would need to accomplish her mission objectives quickly and efficiently, without the luxury of multiple attack runs or extended observation of the target area. Steel 2, we're going to complete the mission, Sarah transmitted. But we're going to do it in a way that those SAM sites won't be expecting. As she spoke, Sarah was already formulating a plan that would use the terrain features of the target valley to mask her approach and provide protection from the air defense systems. The plan would require precision flying at altitudes and in spaces that were well outside the normal parameters for close air support operations, but it was a plan that played to her strengths as a pilot whose smaller stature and exceptional spatial awareness had allowed her to excel in situations where conventional approaches weren't feasible. The narrow valley that represented a challenge for most pilots might actually provide her with the tactical advantage she needed to complete the mission successfully. Anvil 6 Steel Lead, Sarah transmitted to the ground force. We're going to make our attack run from an unconventional direction. Maintain your current position and be prepared to mark targets on my command. The ground force commander's response carried both relief and apprehension. Steel Lead Anvil 6 copies. We're ready to support your attack, but be advised that enemy forces have improved their positions since our last transmission. Sarah acknowledged the information while making final preparations for an attack run that would test both her aircraft and her abilities in ways that training exercises never could. The mission had evolved from routine training to actual combat, and the success or failure of the operation would depend on her ability to execute a plan that conventional tactics would consider impossible. As she approached the target area, Sarah realized that she was about to discover whether the physical characteristics that had nearly prevented her from becoming a fighter pilot would ultimately prove to be the key to her success in actual combat operations. Sarah banked her F-16 into a hard left turn, pulling 4 Gs as she descended toward a gap in the ridgeline that measured barely 60 feet across. Her radar altimeter showed 50 feet of clearance below her aircraft, while the canyon walls rose on both sides like jagged teeth waiting to claim any pilot who miscalculated by even a few degrees. The maneuver she was attempting had never been taught in any military flight school, had never been tested in any simulation. The physics were theoretically possible, but the margin for error was measured in inches rather than the comfortable tolerances that characterized normal flight operations. A slight gust of wind, a momentary lapse in concentration, or a minor mechanical irregularity could transform her aircraft into debris scattered across the Nevada mountainside. Behind her, Captain Torres struggled to maintain visual contact while flying through airspace that seemed designed to challenge every principle of safe formation flying. His F-16 was configured identically to Sarah's, but his 6'4" frame created different sight lines and reach limitations that affected his ability to make the precise control inputs required for terrain-following flight in such constrained spaces. Steel Lead, I'm having trouble maintaining formation in this terrain, Torres transmitted, his voice tight with the strain of flying at the edge of his capabilities. Recommend we climb to a safer altitude for the approach. Sarah's response came without hesitation. though her own stress levels were approaching the limits of what she could manage while maintaining the concentration required for precision flying. Steel 2, maintain best position possible. I'm going to thread through this gap and acquire the target from the north. Follow when able. The gap she was approaching had been identified on her moving map display as a potential route into the target valley, but the electronic charts couldn't convey the visual reality of flying through a space that seemed barely wide enough to accommodate her aircraft's wingspan. The rock walls showed stress fractures and loose debris that could damage her aircraft if disturbed by the wake turbulence from her passage. As Sarah lined up her approach to the gap, her radar warning receiver continued to display threat signals from the surface-to-air missile systems that were tracking her aircraft. The operators of those systems had clearly expected her to approach from conventional directions, using standard altitude profiles that would expose her to their engagement envelopes for predictable periods of time. Instead, Sarah was approaching from an angle and altitude that the missile systems weren't designed to handle. The terrain masking provided by the surrounding ridges blocked the radar's line of sight to her aircraft, creating electronic shadows that would persist until she emerged into the target valley, where the ground force was engaged in combat. The F-16 responded to her control inputs with the precision that had made it the preferred aircraft for pilots who needed to operate in demanding environments. But even the Viper's exceptional handling characteristics were being tested by the flight regime Sarah had selected. The aircraft was flying at airspeeds and altitudes that were outside its normal operational envelope in atmospheric conditions. That created unusual aerodynamic effects. Sarah's smaller stature, which had been a liability during her initial qualification for fighter pilot training, became a critical advantage as she navigated through the gap in the ridgeline. Her lower eye position in the cockpit provided better visibility of the terrain features immediately ahead, while her shorter reach to the controls allowed her to make rapid, precise adjustments without the awkward arm positioning that would have been required for taller pilots. The gap passage lasted only 12 seconds, but it felt like an eternity as Sarah's wingtips cleared the rock walls with clearances that she estimated at less than 10 feet on each side. The aircraft bucked and pitched as it encountered wind currents that were channeled and accelerated by the terrain features, requiring constant control inputs to maintain the precise flight path necessary for safe passage. As she emerged from the gap into the target valley, Sarah's tactical display immediately updated with new information about the combat situation below. The infrared strobe marking friendly positions was clearly visible, pulsing with the distinctive pattern that identified American ground forces. Approximately 200 meters away, she could see muzzle flashes and movement that indicated the locations of hostile forces. Anvil 6, Steel Lead is in the target area, Sarah transmitted while beginning her search for specific targets that she could engage without risk to friendly forces. I have visual on your IR marker. Confirm enemy positions relative to your location. The ground force commander's response came through static punctuated by the sound of automatic weapons fire. Steel Lead, enemy positions are northeast, northwest, and southwest of our location. They're using the terrain for cover and trying to advance on our position from multiple directions. Sarah's analysis of the tactical situation revealed the complexity of the engagement she was being asked to support. The hostile forces had positioned themselves to take advantage of natural cover and concealment, making them difficult targets for conventional air-to-ground weapons. More challenging was the proximity of friendly and enemy forces, which limited her ability to use area effect weapons without risking fratricide. The solution required precision weapons employment at ranges and angles that tested both her aircraft's capabilities and her own skills as a pilot. Sarah selected a GM-65 Maverick missiles from her weapons inventory, precision-guided munitions that could engage point targets with accuracy measured in feet rather than the broader impact patterns of unguided weapons, but employing the Mavericks effectively would require Sarah to maintain stable flight at low altitude, while exposing her aircraft to ground-based threats for the time necessary to acquire, lock, and launch the missiles. The process would take approximately 30 seconds per target, during which her aircraft would be vulnerable to both the surface-to-air missile systems that were tracking her and the small arms fire from the hostile ground forces. Steel 2. I'm going to make attack runs from the north side of the valley, Sarah transmitted to Torres, who was still approaching the target area through the challenging terrain she had just navigated. Provide overwatch and be ready to engage any threats that target me during my weapons runs. Torres acknowledged the instruction, though his aircraft was still several minutes away from reaching a position where he could provide effective support. Sarah would be conducting her initial attack runs without the benefit of mutual support, relying entirely on her own capabilities and the element of surprise to complete her mission objectives. As Sarah began her first attack run, descending to an altitude that brought her within range of small arms fire from the ground, her fuel management calculations became critically important. Each attack run consumed fuel at rates that were significantly higher than normal cruise flight, while the low-altitude operations required power settings that further increased fuel consumption. Her fuel gauge showed approximately 35 minutes of flight time remaining, but that estimate was based on normal flight operations rather than the demanding profile she was flying. The actual time available for combat operations would be significantly less, possibly as little as 15 minutes before she would need to begin her return to Nellis to ensure she didn't run out of fuel before reaching the base. The first Maverick missile launched with a brief flash of ignition followed by the smooth acceleration of the weapon toward its target. Sarah's heads-up display showed the missile's guidance system acquiring the target she had designated, a defensive position that was providing covering fire for hostile forces attempting to advance on the friendly ground team. The missile impact was visible as a brief flash followed by a cloud of dust and debris that obscured the target area temporarily. When the dust cleared, the position showed no further signs of activity, indicating that the weapon had achieved its intended effect. Anvil 6, Steel Lead. First target neutralized. Confirm remaining threat positions, Sarah transmitted while maneuvering to line up for her second attack run. The ground force commander's response carried noticeably less stress than his previous transmissions. Steel Lead, excellent work. Enemy fire from the northeast position has ceased. We're still taking effective fire from northwest and southwest positions. Sarah's second attack run required her to approach from a different angle, exposing her aircraft to fire from the remaining hostile positions while she acquired and engaged her next target. As she descended toward her attack altitude, her radar warning receiver suddenly erupted with alarm tones indicating that one of the surface-to-air missile systems had achieved a firing solution and was preparing to launch. The missile launch was visible as a brief streak of light rising from a position approximately 3 miles south of the target valley. Sarah's training and reflexes took over, initiating a series of defensive maneuvers designed to defeat the incoming threat while maintaining her ability to complete her attack run. The SA-18 surface-to-air missile was a sophisticated weapon system capable of engaging fighter aircraft at ranges up to 6 kilometers. Its infrared guidance system was designed to home in on the heat signature of jet engines, making it particularly effective against aircraft operating at the low altitudes where such signatures were most pronounced. Sarah's defensive response involved a combination of electronic countermeasures, evasive maneuvering, and the deployment of flares designed to confuse the missile's guidance system. But the most effective element of her defense was the terrain masking provided by the valley walls, which broke the missile's lock and caused it to lose track of her aircraft. The missile detonated harmlessly against a ridgeline approximately 500 meters from Sarah's position, its proximity fuse triggered by the rocky terrain rather than her aircraft. But the engagement had consumed precious time and fuel, while alerting other air defense systems to her presence and tactics. Steel. Lead, Anvil 6. We observed the SAM launch and your evasive maneuvers. Are you still able to continue the attack? The ground force commander asked, his voice carrying concern about both the air threat and the continuing ground engagement. Sarah checked her aircraft systems while maneuvering for her second attack run. All systems were functioning normally, with no damage from the missile engagement. Her fuel remaining showed 28 minutes, still adequate to complete her planned attacks if she could do so without further delays. Anvil 6, Steel Lead is continuing the attack, Sarah replied while acquiring her second target through the Maverick's guidance system. Stand by for second missile launch. The second Maverick engaged a machine gun position that had been providing suppressive fire against the friendly ground force. The weapon's impact eliminated the threat and allowed the ground team to begin maneuvering to more defensible positions within the valley. But as Sarah prepared for her third and final attack run, her radar warning receiver indicated that additional surface-to-air missile systems were activating in response to her presence. The electronic environment was becoming increasingly hostile, with multiple threats attempting to engage her aircraft simultaneously. Steel 2, what's your position? Sarah asked Torres, hoping that her wingman had successfully navigated the terrain and could provide support for her final attack. Torres' response came through heavy static, suggesting that his aircraft was still operating in the challenging electromagnetic environment created by the terrain and the active air defense systems. Steel Lead, I'm still inbound through the gap. 8 at to target area, approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes was longer than Sarah could afford to wait. The remaining hostile position was maintaining effective fire against the friendly ground force while additional air defense threats were preparing to engage her aircraft. She needed to complete her mission quickly and begin her extraction from the target area before the tactical situation deteriorated further. Sarah's final attack run brought her to within 200 feet of the ground, flying at airspeeds that left no margin for error in the confined spaces of the target valley. Her third Maverick missile eliminated the final hostile position, effectively ending the ground engagement and allowing the friendly forces to consolidate their defensive positions. Anvil 6, Steel Lead, all designated targets neutralized. What is your current tactical situation? Sarah transmitted while beginning her climb out of the target valley. The ground force commander's response carried obvious relief. Steel Lead, hostile fire has ceased. We have 2 wounded personnel but no fatalities. We are secure in our current position and can conduct our own extraction. Outstanding work. As Sarah climbed away from the target area, her fuel gauge showed 23 minutes remaining, barely adequate for the return flight to Nellis under normal conditions. But her route back to base would require her to again navigate through the challenging terrain that had brought her to the target, while potentially facing continued threats from the air defense systems that were now fully alert to her presence. Successful completion of her attack mission had saved the lives of the friendly ground force, but it had also committed her to a return flight that would test her aircraft, her fuel management, and her flying skills to their absolute limits. The consequences of her decision to engage in unconventional tactics were now becoming apparent as she faced the challenge of extracting from a hostile environment with minimal resources and no margin for error. The satellite imagery arrived at the Pentagon at 13:47 hours Eastern Standard Time, transmitted from a reconnaissance platform that had been monitoring the engagement in the Nevada Test and Training Range. The images showed the aftermath of Lieutenant Sarah Chun's attack mission with clarity that left no room for interpretation or debate. 3 hostile positions had been eliminated with surgical precision, their coordinates matching exactly with the target locations that Sarah had engaged during her unauthorized deviation from standard close air support procedures. The imagery showed blast patterns consistent with a GM-65 Maverick missile impacts, with collateral damage limited to the immediate target areas and no evidence of harm to friendly forces. General Patricia Hawkins, Director of Air Force Operations, studied the satellite photographs while reviewing the preliminary after-action reports from the ground force that had requested emergency support. The mission had been successful by any measure that mattered, but it had also involved tactical decisions that challenged fundamental assumptions about fighter aircraft capabilities and pilot limitations. The terrain analysis is particularly interesting, Colonel James Mitchell, the intelligence officer briefing the general, said while pointing to topographical overlays that showed the route Sarah had flown to reach the target area. Lieutenant Chun's aircraft transited through spaces that our computer models indicated were impassable for fixed-wing aircraft. General Hawkins leaned forward to examine the route more closely. The flight path showed Sarah's F-16 threading through gaps in the ridgeline that measured less than 70 feet across, flying at altitudes that brought her within 50 feet of rocky terrain that could have destroyed her aircraft with the slightest navigation error. "What's the minimum safe clearance for F-16 operations in mountainous terrain?" the general asked. "Standard procedures require 500 feet of clearance from terrain features," Mitchell replied. The lieutenant was operating at clearances that were less than 1/10 of that minimum. The implications were staggering. Sarah had accomplished her mission by flying through spaces that military doctrine considered impossible to navigate safely. Her success challenged not only the assumptions about what F-16 aircraft could accomplish, but also the physical requirements that had been established for the pilots who flew them. At Nellis Air Force Base, Sarah sat in the same debriefing room, where she had been questioned after her return from the mission. But the atmosphere had changed dramatically since her initial interrogation. The three colonels who had grilled her about her unauthorized actions were now studying intelligence reports that vindicated every decision she had made. Colonel Martinez opened the updated mission file, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Lieutenant Chen, we have confirmation from multiple sources that your tactical assessment was correct. The ground force you supported was engaged by hostile elements that had infiltrated the northern sectors of the range through routes that our security systems hadn't identified." Sarah nodded, though she felt no satisfaction in being proven right. The mission had been successful, but it had also revealed serious gaps in the security of one of America's most sensitive training areas. The infiltration of hostile forces into the Nevada Test and Training Range represented an intelligence failure with implications that extended far beyond her individual actions. The surface-to-air missile systems that engaged your aircraft have been identified as advanced foreign technology, Colonel Washington added. Their presence within the range suggests a level of hostile capability that our intelligence assessments had not anticipated. The revelation that foreign forces had somehow established sophisticated air defense systems within American airspace was deeply troubling. It suggested either a catastrophic failure of border security or the presence of adversaries with capabilities that exceeded current intelligence estimates. Colonel Brooks consulted his briefing notes before continuing. "The precision of your weapons employment has been confirmed through battle damage assessment. All three targets were neutralized with no collateral damage to friendly forces or civilian infrastructure. The ground force commander has submitted a formal commendation for your actions." Sarah maintained her professional composure, though she felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The successful completion of her mission had saved lives and eliminated threats, but it had also required her to violate protocols and procedures that existed for valid safety reasons. "What's the status of the investigation into my unauthorized deviation from mission parameters?" Sarah asked. Colonel Martinez closed the file folder and looked directly at her. "The investigation has been concluded. Your actions have been classified as appropriate response to emergency conditions, with commendation for exceptional performance under combat conditions." The words carried weight that Sarah understood immediately. Instead of facing disciplinary action for her unauthorized mission, she was being recognized for tactical excellence and professional judgment. The military bureaucracy that had initially threatened to end her career was now acknowledging that her decisions had been not only correct but essential. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the crew chief who had been documenting the damage to Sarah's aircraft, entered the debriefing room with a tablet containing his final maintenance report. His expression mixed professional satisfaction with obvious amazement at what he had discovered during his technical analysis. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez said, "I've completed the full inspection of your aircraft. The damage patterns tell a story that I've never seen before in 23 years of working on fighters." Sarah waited for him to continue, unsure whether his report would support or complicate her situation. "The wing tip scratches show contact with rock surfaces at 17 different points during your flight," Rodriguez continued. "The spacing and angles indicate that you were flying through spaces that required constant correction to maintain clearance. The stress patterns on the airframe show G-forces that should have caused structural failure, but the aircraft held together because of the precision of your control inputs. The technical analysis provided objective evidence of the flying Sarah had accomplished during her mission. The aircraft itself had become a witness to maneuvers that would have been impossible for pilots operating under normal physical and procedural constraints. Most significantly," Rodriguez added, "the cockpit instrumentation recorded flight parameters that our engineering specifications said were impossible for this aircraft type. You were flying in a flight regime that we didn't know existed." The implications extended beyond Sarah's individual performance to the broader capabilities of both F-16 aircraft and the pilots who flew them. Her mission had demonstrated that the limitations imposed by doctrine and procedure were more conservative than the actual capabilities of the equipment and personnel. Captain Torres, who had finally reached the target area in time to provide cover for Sarah's extraction, entered the room with his own debriefing materials. His expression showed a combination of admiration and professional concern about the flying he had witnessed. "I've flown with some exceptional pilots," Torres said, "but what Lieutenant Chen accomplished yesterday was beyond anything I've seen. She was flying through spaces that I couldn't have imagined attempting, while maintaining the precision necessary to employ weapons effectively against ground targets." Torres' testimony carried special weight because he had observed Sarah's flying from the perspective of another experienced fighter pilot. His assessment provided independent confirmation of the exceptional nature of her performance. "The extraction was particularly impressive," Torres continued. "She had to navigate back through the same terrain obstacles while managing a critically low fuel state and potential threats from additional air defense systems. Most pilots would have declared an emergency and requested immediate assistance. Instead, Sarah had completed her extraction without additional support, demonstrating the same precision and judgment that had characterized her entire mission. Her fuel management had been calculated to within minutes of her actual requirements, showing planning and execution that left no margin for error. General Hawkins arrived at Nellis that afternoon, traveling from the Pentagon specifically to meet with Sarah and review the mission firsthand. The general's presence at a routine base indicated the level of attention that Sarah's mission had generated at the highest levels of Air Force leadership. "Lieutenant Chun," General Hawkins said as she entered the briefing room, "your mission yesterday has generated significant interest in Washington. We need to understand exactly how you accomplished what our computer models said was impossible." Sarah stood at attention, though the general's tone suggested that this was a professional consultation rather than a formal interrogation. The shift in attitude from her initial debriefing was dramatic, reflecting the changing assessment of her actions as intelligence reports confirmed the accuracy of her tactical judgment. "General, I used the terrain features to mask my approach and provide protection from the air defense systems," Sarah explained. The narrow flight corridors required precision flying, but they also provided concealment that larger aircraft formations couldn't have achieved. The general studied the mission map, tracing Sarah's flight path with her finger. The intelligence reports indicate that this was a well-planned infiltration by foreign forces. They had established air defense systems and ground positions that would have been extremely difficult to defeat using conventional tactics. Sarah nodded, understanding that her success had implications beyond her individual performance. The mission had revealed both the presence of sophisticated threats and the capabilities needed to defeat them. Your physical characteristics, which initially created challenges for your qualification as a fighter pilot, appear to have been essential to your success, General Hawkins observed. Would you agree with that assessment? The question struck at the heart of Sarah's entire military career. The height waiver that had allowed her to fly had been controversial and had required extensive justification. Now the same physical characteristics that had nearly disqualified her were being recognized as tactical advantages. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. My smaller stature allowed me to operate in confined spaces where larger pilots would have had difficulty. The precision required for the mission played to my strengths rather than highlighting my limitations. General Hawkins made notes on her tablet while considering the broader implications of Sarah's success. The mission had demonstrated capabilities that the Air Force hadn't known it possessed, while also revealing the value of diversity in pilot selection and training. Lieutenant Chen, you are being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions, the general announced. Additionally, your mission profile is being studied for potential inclusion in advanced tactical training programs. The award was one of the highest decorations for aerial achievement, recognizing not only Sarah's individual performance, but also the strategic value of her tactical innovation. More importantly, the decision to incorporate her methods into training program suggested that her success would influence future Air Force operations. As the debriefing concluded and the various officers departed, Sarah found herself alone with the realization that her career had been fundamentally transformed by a single mission. The physical characteristics that had nearly prevented her from becoming a fighter pilot had ultimately enabled her to accomplish something that no other pilot in the Air Force could have achieved. The F-16 that had carried her through the impossible mission sat in the maintenance hangar, its battle damage serving as a permanent reminder of what could be accomplished when exceptional skill combined with unique physical attributes to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's mission had proven that the most effective military capabilities sometimes emerged from the places where conventional wisdom suggested they couldn't exist. The pilot who was too short to fly had squeezed through enemy lines in ways that redefined what was possible for both aircraft and the people who flew them. The victory belonged not just to Sarah, but to the principle that exceptional performance could emerge from unexpected sources, and that the most valuable military assets were often those that didn't fit conventional specifications. Her success had vindicated not only her own career choices, but the wisdom of military leaders who were willing to look beyond traditional requirements to find the capabilities that would define the future of aerial warfare. In the end, Sarah Chen had proven that sometimes the smallest pilots could accomplish the biggest missions, and that the most important qualifications for military aviation couldn't be measured in inches or pounds, but in the courage, skill, and determination that turned impossible missions into extraordinary victories. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.